Hi, everybody. I'm so excited to have here with us Hannah Ruth Dyson. She's the founder of Soul Seed Gathering, a modern day explorer on ancient women's wisdom, ancestral women's wisdom, and also a very important advocate for sustainability, earth care, and more. Hannah, thank you so much for joining this podcast.
Thank you for having me, Natalia.
Hannah, I want to start by asking you, because we are having all these conversations about, this new episode in humankind's history, which is the COVID-19 pandemic. And there's a lot of talk on the lessons that we need to learn in terms of the environment, and if this system, worldwide international system, is gonna sustain itself, or if there's gonna be a new world order. What are your views on this COVID-19 pandemic? And then we can start, untangling a bit for everybody that's tuning in.
I have a lot of views. What immediately jumped to my mind just then, when you said New World Order, is because the first time I heard that in the media recently was from Henry Kissinger, and that immediately gave me, it kind of lit me up, because I back when I was 18 and I was traveling, I made it to Cambodia, and it was the first time I really understood what had taken place in Cambodia, and likened my experience. I'm sure it's much like visiting a concentration camp in Germany. It really affected me, and looking into it then, the name Henry Kissinger came up, and I realized then who this guy was, and since then have just seen how much sort of atrocities are like directly linked to him and his decision making, and he is a huge representative of American foreign policy and American dominance across the world. And just hearing him, first of all, it's just amazing to me that he still has a voice and he is allowed to contribute. And the fact that he is saying there's going to be a new world order, to me is really scary, because I don't know what that means exactly from him. But what we don't want to move into from this pandemic is further control and domination and so forth. I think we have been given this, incredible opportunity from this incredible hardship. There are people dying, and a lot of fear, a lot of anxiety, a lot of people struggling. I want to really honor all the people, who are losing jobs and who are really vulnerable at this time, because of course it's always the people at the lowest sections of society who are doing all the service jobs, who are making paycheck to paycheck, that are really vulnerable right now. And when we look back in history, we see that often through either pandemics or war, that and fear, that more domination or more control comes into play. So I think we need to wake up right now and pay attention to where this can lead, and see the opportunity to really, I think, shift into a new world order. In my fantasy, it is, in my dreams, it would be really working with Indigenous people, because they are by far the best custodians we know of this earth. And it's really recognizing that we are not just here to extract and to dump our waste on earth. It's here to really work in the cycles of nature, and to recognize that we are not here to dominate and control. We are here to really, I think, work abundantly. And we really, I think many studies have shown that, in fact, just by shifting our systems, we really could feed everyone. We really could support this huge human population that there is. But the current way things are working, and it goes all the way from farming to huge industry to oil extraction to coal and so on, like all of these things need to be revisited and shifted at this time. And a lot of them are actually already failing, these typical industries. But the way we cling to what we know and what feels safe, and these industries have been often deemed too big to fail, And so right now, as they are failing, we have an opportunity to really rebuild and reshift. And so while it'd be beautiful to create a new world order in the sense of a global community, and I would be all for dropping borders and being more sort of collaborative across the world, I also think at the same time we need to move back to the village and more local powers and more decision making made for community, where we can think on all levels, of elders to children, and we don't have this whole society that, for in this great experiment of industrialization and civilization and patriarchy, we can see the huge failings. We can see, of course, the incredible benefits of technology. Being able to communicate right now from Mexico to Costa Rica is incredible. And I don't think we need to deny any of that. I just think we need to start reclaiming the things that we've lost and start moving into the future where really everyone can win. I really think the economic system is also going to move forward in the sense that, you've even seen this in small ways in farming practices, where farmers who are actually boldly stepping back, like away from these kind of monocrops that have been failing them slowly, like year after year, giving them less and less and less, to more integrated, better farming practices that can help like work with the earth systems and so forth. They're actually already seeing that they're receiving more money. And so when we can start to fit into our economic systems where it's good for the earth, it's good for the community, it's good for all. It's not just this idealistic thing. It's something that can actually, I think, start to be implemented more and considered more. And I think this huge pause on everyone's lives is also, I think, I'm hearing from everywhere, like people are really seeing the gifts of this time of more rest, of more time with their family, and maybe just evaluating our values, because we've been so I can speak for myself, going from school to like already needing to know what I'm going to study at university, to then already having to think about a career. And I kind of shifted my path right after university, so I didn't go too deep in, but I could see how you go from one step to the next and you don't really have time to think about what changes should be taking place. You're just fitting within the system, and then you are likely have debt and are likely trying to get onto the property ladder and just keep up within the system that is not really built to support most of us, and so you don't actually get time to even think like, how should things change, or what should happen, or what do I really care about? You're just doing what is kind of expected of you. And then very quickly you see people who have midlife crisis, who have breakdowns, the crazy amounts of depression and anxiety and stress and suicide rates. These are all symptoms of our disconnect and so forth. And I think all of these, now we have this blessing of time to consider, what are my values and what will I not let go of? And it can start off really small, what in my immediate life, what is so vitally important, like growing my own food, knowing my community of growers so I can also exchange and be not so also sometimes the conversation is about getting so like highly independent, I'm going to feed myself, I'm going to look after myself. But I'm grateful to live here where I have a community, and I'm like, okay, I can really and we all have different harvests of different fruits and vegetables at different times, and you always have most likely an abundance at the time where you don't excess that you don't need. So that's when you can really start to work in these smaller community levels and consider, how do I want my child to be educated? How do I want my social life? Like, what is really important? And then that ripples out, into our bigger systems. And really, we still have such power with our money, with where we put our money and where we buy, what we buy into. And so on a large scale, when we really start to look at that and take accountability person to person, that also shifts. We're seeing that again in huge industries that are now failing because people aren't really buying it anymore. And so that really helps us rebuild hopefully into these more sustainable, self-sufficient systems that can support everyone.
Okay, I'm gonna stop you there because there's a lot to talk about. No, I mean I'm amazed because you created like this brainstorm of ideas, and I want to like pick on it and start like working with you and understanding a lot better. I loved how you started with this whole concept of the New World System and tying it to Henry Kissinger. There's always in history books there's a lot of conversation of what was the first world order, you know, like was it the late 1950s or the 1920s, or was it centuries ago, with the discovery of the Americas, which was always considered the new world, coming to the new world. And it is very interesting to see that the world itself, the history of humankind, has several new world orders, like the ways that it behaved, and it correlated between states and between tribes and between communities. And are we okay, or are we righteous on saying that we are on the brink of a new development of a new world order? Or is it just, a new concept that we need to think about? It's just that there's many times to say new, and it's like it's new, but it's like 7 times new, so it's just weird.
Well, I think it's interesting because when we look at like civilizations in the past that have collapsed, and then it's not like everyone disappears. There's like a huge transition period, and sometimes you don't know you're actually in that transition period until you look back and you're like, yeah, that. And I do think this civilization is, I think many people have foreseen that this was going to collapse quicker than any other civilization. And I think this is it. I think this is, you just see how this, seemingly small virus, just how quickly it impacts the whole fragile system, and everything is brought really to the ground. And so everything is new every day, every breath, every experience. We can always decide what is new. And in terms of how, who knows exactly the world order, I do think there are these moments in history where we can see consolidations of power, and of course with colonization, and you can see like these moments where like the so-called Great British Empire was a sort of consolidation of power and so on. And just looking into history, it does seem around the end of World War II, when like the formation of the CIA happened, and this I was like actually recently just looking into how the CIA began in the United States, and it really was from the very beginning this mindset that we need to protect America's ideals and need to be in every country influencing and basically stamping out these radical thinkers who are talking about socialism and communism and so forth. And just that beginning, I think right there was the sort of, and of course America having influenced the war towards the end, I think that really brought her into the sort of idea of being the center of power. And it's interesting because I was hearing someone recently who is American. I'm of course British, and we are very we've become closer and closer linked, I think, to America. But someone was explaining that it wasn't until they left the United States that they realized a lot of the world don't see America in the way that America sees themselves. And it's just an interesting point of view, but we can't deny America's influence. In fact, it's not until I had a research job for a documentary company that was, looking at all the world events, and I had to become so knowledgeable of everything. And I really did see, and Kissinger being a person who's had influence in so many, countries, and is really responsible for millions of deaths because he sent weapons to the military in Pakistan to create a genocide in Bangladesh. He influenced Argentina to kill its civilians, and who knows the numbers there, and then East Timor and all these places that we don't necessarily learn about growing up or see in the media, so we don't even really know what took place. But it does seem like for a while, and there are theories that at the beginning of the CIA it was very much influenced by the top industry leaders in steel, coal, and these wealthy figures who, many conspiracy theorists for a long time have been speaking about the new world order that is coming, and the Illuminati, and the people who are really running things. And it does seem like there's a lot of evidence to say that there's something beyond borders of control. Certain things like when the I've forgotten the big company, I've lost the name of GMO crop spraying.
Monsanto?
Yeah, Monsanto got sold to like the biggest company in Europe, and it's like, it just seems strange because it's like, okay, there's some decisions here being made that you would think America would protect one of its largest companies, and there's something going on there where they don't seem to be afraid that Europe has it. So who knows? Anyway, for me, I think I care most about not really focusing too much actually on those people who are in power, who claim to be in power, because I don't see them as powerful. And I think my whole work around the deep feminine and working with Indigenous people is not just like, oh, this romantic idea of femininity or of Indigenous people. No, it's like, no, I think the true power only really lies when you're able to really be with the earth, and working with her, and acknowledging. I mean, I'm always curious, like when you look across the world and you think like, why have women been suppressed everywhere? Like, what is so scary and powerful about women that we need to be, attacked sexually? We need to be abused. We need, like, there's something that is very intimidating, and I think it's in direct conflict to the civilization and patriarchal ideals of control and domination. And you can see it in science and technology now, where it's like, let's conquer death, let's live to let's create this obsession with longevity, and which I'm all for. But it's like, I work with Indigenous female elders who are like, sometimes 103, and they're still dancing on the mountain, and I'm like, that doesn't fit within the narrative that our modern civilization is the only one progressing longevity and so forth. Anyway, it's like, I think the true power lies there, and if everyone in society, all of us who are on the ground, really recognized it and started living from that place, I think the ripple effect would be huge, and we would be the new world order.
I want to touch more about your work with the colonization and the colonized mindset, because here in Latin America, and also I think the global South, we're still dealing with the remnants of these colonization periods and these colonizers, which still with their foreign policies are influencing still their spheres, and I want to touch upon that, because your conversation is so key and we're losing track of that. Like, who's right now, making the rules and that everybody else should follow, and why are states subjected due to economic pressure or political ideas, etc., to follow what other previous colonizers thought or think that they should do. And I want to tie that question with this whole concept of what you're saying, the further control and domination, this patriarchic order and this way of seeing the world and seeing power, the concept of power, is very male-centric, but very masculine, hegemonic-centric, hegemonic masculinity kind of conception of power. And we are currently having male leaders and also some female leaders, not all of them, that are employing this term of wartime presidents, and we are combating an invisible enemy. Um, and yeah, these are like two questions in one, but I think they're all tied to this concept of power.
Mhm.
And I want to know more about your views.
Yeah, what was key in my own journey is, and I like really am trying to bring light to for all, especially white European uh, heritage people, is the fact that we were internally colonized before we went out and colonized the world. And that was such a key understanding for me, because I grew up with the knowledge of us being, well, this teaching of us being developed, and we're here to kind of save and help the rest of the world. And I'm still like baffled at like how I was taught history and what was left out from the way I was taught history. But yeah, it was understanding that helped me decolonize internally and begin to understand how even, and it's insidious because patriarchy and this toxic masculine like mindset, it's actually comes through all of us because we've all been brought up in this culture and society. And so it's really creepy sometimes how it comes through you, and you can see it coming through the most conscious, spiritual, well-meaning people, and they still have these tendencies, because it's just the way we've been schooled and programmed and conditioned. So, but once we start to unravel that, which seems kind of scary at first, but it's so liberating and freeing and beautiful, like the gifts are like endless, we can begin to shift things. And yeah, it's really important to understand the colonized mindset and how insidious this is, because it shows up, I mean, in so many different areas. And the one that I'm kind of passionate about talking about a lot of the time is the nonprofit and charity world and aid work. And particularly in aid, I have several friends who've worked in aid who became so demoralized by what they witnessed and what they saw, because what takes place typically from countries when they give aid is that it's often self-serving, and that countries that are in the most need, that have experienced disasters or in a really vulnerable place, they are given a support, but it's given with a set of conditions, which that make you then beholden to the country that's given. And America's been like, it's been excellent at playing that game and making many countries completely dependent on it to a certain extent. And I think that's kind of failing now anyway, because I think America is a bubble its economy has been a bubble. Like so many things are just a mirage with what it's been, but it cares so much about its image in the world and so forth. So once we recognize that, we recognize also that how that comes up in everyday life, because we all want to do good and we want to help. But a huge part of my work has been trying to challenge that and change the narrative that we're not here to save indigenous people or so-called developing countries. We actually have a lot to learn from them. And of course, we have things to offer and things that can really support people. But it should always be in a mindset of, I think, being more humble and being more in a learning space. And I think what needs to happen often when we're talking about helping other countries, it needs a lot of time, because there's no quick fix, like bulldozing sort of solutions, which again often takes place and creates, and Africa's like really the worst example across Africa, the amount of charity and nonprofit and aid work that's gone in that has created these huge disparities and dysfunctions, and just made things many times worse than it was to begin with. And a lot of work has also been done to change that and shift that and try and do better. But we have to take also accountability to where our money goes when we're thinking we're doing good. And I think just realizing, I mean, I'm still working on it, and I've been in this work now for 5+ years specifically with Indigenous people is this realizing I've been schooled again and again and again to see myself as civilized, to see myself as developed, to see myself as progression and all those things. And it's so in the narratives of everything. And even when we look at this response to, again, like you said, warfare, like this virus is a warfare, and it's like, no, this virus is a teacher. How did it even begin? And you look at how it began, and how actually I've been learning a lot through this experience of how every virus has happened from too close proximity to animals, and to animals being kept in a way that's not like good for the animals. And you see, because a big question came up that I realized I hadn't asked previously was, why was it when, you know, the colonizers arrived in the so-called New World, and they spread diseases from Europe, but they weren't actually infected by diseases from the what's now known as the Americas. And the reality is that Indigenous people, Native people, had a relationship with animals. They still ate animals, but they were living in harmony, and they were more wild, and they were more free to roam. They weren't in these intense, close proximities. And even like the common cold comes from horses being kept in close. I mean, I was learning so much about viruses. So if we're not looking at why these things begin and what our problems are, then I don't want to live in a world where we're just constantly pumping out vaccines, and always trying to come up with solutions. And many people predicting right now that this is the first wave of many, and this is going to be a new normal, being in quarantine. And that kind of mentality is so scary. And it's just, we have to really be part of this conversation right now. What is happening to our liberties? What is happening to our freedom of speech? What is happening to our ability to protest, to look at what else is being going on, because we're all quarantined? And is this something that we choose? Because we've had this obsession as a civilization, and with technology and with science and so forth, with prolonging life, but at the expense of really living. This is how I see it. Because even the way we're told to parent, which has become more and more this, the concept of like the helicopter parent, which is, you know, constantly your biggest job is to make sure your child doesn't die. And I am a parent, so I understand that you know, that tendency to like, I need to make sure my child is safe. And so the best way to make sure your child is safe is to control everything, to not, you know, I mean, my parents' generation talked about going out in the wild and nature for hours, and their parents wouldn't know where they were or what was going on. It would never happen now. I mean, it is happening to, parents and families who are trying to reclaim, and there has to be something where, you know, I'm watching it now with my child. Like, I want him to be able to explore and have a little bit of, and you increase a little bit each time the amount of space he has to explore. My son is still 2.5, so, you know, he's fast. He wants to go everywhere. But it's this mentality. I don't want to hold him back from living. And likewise with myself, I want to live well and not be afraid of death. And I think this is something we can really learn from Indigenous peoples and our own ancestral traditions, is that there was this huge reverence for death, not as an ending, but as a transition. And there's less attachment to who I am in this lifetime, this person. I need to cling on to it, you know, being on life support, just extending it no matter what. And it's like, you see with Indigenous people, this huge respect for death and this idea of dying well. And I don't think we're going to be dying well if we are we're prevented from hugging and embracing people and being more in community. And I don't mean that to kind of, I think we're doing what we're learning as we go right now, what we are choosing. But
at the same time, it looks like these quarantine measures worldwide are pushing everything to the extreme.
Mm-hmm.
And some governments do not know how to rail back. And you see here in Latin America, like Mexico, for example, yes, it has been criticized by the way it has approached the pandemic, but at the same time, it has not incurred in a major big debt to try to rescue a system that is knows its failures, you know. And here 60% of the population works in the informal economy, and they live day by day. They don't have, you know, a social welfare, a good social welfare that they can stay at home. Here the realities are very different. I think it's going to happen the same in other countries in the developing world, which is a question of why developed countries took such extreme measures of quarantine. And one of the greatest alarms for me, following this as a journalist, has been how the narrative, the media narrative, as well as government's narrative, has changed from seeking treatments and seeking vaccines or seeking ways to deal with it, but more into, like you said, uh, um, how is it, approving measures to limit the freedom of movement, limit the freedom of speech, limit the freedom of living the way that we want to live, and promoting this fear-mongering campaign of, you know, you have to be wary of each other, you cannot approach to anybody, you need to stay at home because that's the way that you are a soldier for those who cannot save themselves. And I think that we are following that narrative because that's what the officials are saying, and because we simply do not know the extent of the virus. Most of us, we're not scientifics. But then you start hearing scientific community, which are also speaking out in other alternative medias, and they're also launching their own podcasts trying to share what the governments are, you know, trying to hide. And it's like, yes, this virus spreads very easily, yes, we should not take it very lightly, but instead of focusing on revamping the social welfare or revamping the health ministries and, you know, the health of the state, it's more focusing, all the efforts are focusing on the economics and the politics instead of just what is this truly teaching us. This is not sustainable, and we do not have good health systems that can deal with new kind of viruses or developments. And in that way, I want to touch a bit on something that you said that really caught my attention. You were saying that we are not here to save indigenous people, and we're not here to save developing countries. And I think it's very, very important that we touch on that, because many people that could be watching this video or that will be hearing the podcast are wondering, what are we gonna do? I mean, we are wondering, we are privileged somehow living in these countries, but there are other people that are not as privileged. And even in America, you know, that we are right now talking about like a food crisis, and people probably, you know, the rate of hunger will increase in America, which you will think is unthinkable because it's such a developed country and, you know, such a world power. And I want to ask you, if we're not here to save developing countries and we're not here to save indigenous peoples in this time of pandemics, which is like worldwide, you talked in earlier about the need for global cooperation and a global community. Do you think in this time, rather maybe not, the word is not safe, but maybe we really need to reach out, or each country should deal with it on itself? What are your views on this?
It's so it's complex. I'm also not 100% sure. You know, it's like it's a discussion and exploration. So I'm not going to pretend I have the answers. But there are certain things that we need to recognize. Like, for example, when Hurricane Katrina happened in the United States, the way American people were treated and had no access to rescue or supplies, or that doesn't look like a developed wealthy nation. That looks like a struggling nation. So yeah, and the vast amount of homeless people, there's a lot of things to work out internally. And also I do think we have this tendency as humans to cooperate and to help and to give where we can give. And there's that natural energy that's very true and beautiful and also needed. And I think it shouldn't be shut down, but we need to be really aware of what hides under that umbrella. So what takes place, like I mentioned, with aid and how it became very self-serving in many cases. There's been work done on disaster capitalism and that concept. It's like that understanding. And we also need to look at ourselves, because I know people who started organizations and they try to, raise money, like Sean Corn did, like yoga off the mat, like trying to get yoga people compassionate about people. And she would say, no one would sign up for a city in the United States to help like children who can't eat and children who can't get to school, or, all those things. They all want to go to India to work with the child prostitutes there. And of course, that's like a huge issue that needs to, it needs support, it needs help.
But at the same time, like developing countries currently are, specifically in Latin America and Africa, which are like the cases that I know of, they are saying, we are here with our own problems, and this pandemic was not created by us, and you're bringing it to us. Like there's this conversation on the duty or the responsibility of these developed countries, as they were so eager to bring aid and to try to bring education and evangelization and all that to these nations, and suddenly right now they're closing borders, they're trying to deal with their own problems, and they don't care about what's happening in their spheres of influence, or the countries that they're supposed to be helping right now, and that are more vulnerable. And I'm not saying, that the whole question is, there's this clientelism dynamic, and this dependency model that is being promoted by foreign policies, yes, but there's also a question of whether or not in these dire times for everybody, there's a big responsibility for the developed countries that used to help the other ones, because now it's like, this is the moment that you need to help the most, because they're most vulnerable right now. So I don't know, there's, I know that we're just discussing, but what are your views? What do you think?
There's definitely huge responsibilities that we should be held accountable to. I think a huge one is, for example, fast fashion, high street clothing brands who are now cutting all supplies to, really impoverished areas that are really like have learned to be dependent on this like pitiful income that these companies, and so to completely suddenly cut that, I think is highly irresponsible. And it's those kind of things I think we should be really held accountable for. You can't just cut your losses, right? And just like this huge brands trying to save themselves rather than taking responsibility for their whole supply chain. That's a huge issue. And then what came to my mind also was it's complicated right now with so for one it's the question of like anyone entering into another country, are you actually a problem because you're going to be transmitting the virus or the disease? So that's a huge issue. And so right now where my main focus has been is looking at what's taking place in indigenous communities, and they have always been vulnerable to our diseases and our viruses coming in. What's taking place right now while we're all in quarantine is that certain governments are in full acknowledgement that miners, gold miners, oil, are going into these territories illegally, and poisoning rivers, spreading these diseases. And this is taking place. It's like this desperate attempt to, still make money. And of course, and the worrying thing that's taking place right now is actually in the United States, they just dropped all environmental protections that need to be in place for industries. Like they need to make sure that they're, fulfilling a certain level of protection and safety. And that's all been dropped to try and save these industries. So they are able to do whatever they want now in these territories. And so, even within the United States and Canada, you have, of course, all of these indigenous nations, these native nations that are once again vulnerable to being encroached upon, oil pipelines being built. Apparently we're all in quarantine, but somehow some of these oil pipelines are still getting built while we're all closed in. And it's these things that so detrimental to the health. So it's definitely complicated. I do think there's a responsibility to continue funding and money going to these developing nations that have become dependent and beholden to, like, if you've created the dependency, you can't just cut it off, which is of course terrible, because that's exactly what countries want to do. They want to protect themselves first thing. Industries want to protect themselves. And so what I do hope from all of this is that we will all learn in smaller communities to look after ourselves again, and to be able to feed ourselves.
What can we do in that case that you were mentioning, the miners and gold entering? I know that there are some extractive industries, illegal extraction industries in Central America and Costa Rica, where you're at. There's also some reports.
I haven't actually heard anything specifically in Costa Rica. I've been mainly in Brazil. Mm-hmm. Mainly in Brazil, I've just heard that, and I think in Ecuador and in...
But that's very alarming, don't you think? It's like, I mean, there's a sense of dropping everything out, because you can get the virus and people don't want to get the disease, etc. And there's this whole, campaign for nobody to get out of their houses. But then you have what you were mentioning, miners that continue going to work, illegal groups that want to take over and poison rivers. I mean, that's very disturbing, but it's more disturbing because you have, for example, UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres is asking for a global ceasefire. And you had ISIS telling their combatants to not go near Europe so they didn't bring the disease back into the field where they're having the conflict in Syria or Iraq. And suddenly it's like the major, the people are doing destruction of the earth that are continuing exploiting it, like the same thing that you said at the beginning of the conversation, the whole exploitation, control, domination, continue doing so without any, with impunity, because nobody's looking, nobody's observing, because everybody's quarantined, or the government knows, but it's like giving them a free way, which can happen. We know some cases which can happen. I mean, I'm bedazzled, and I want to know, what can we do?
I think there's many things we can do. I think talking about it is a huge thing, bringing attention and awareness to it. And for example, there's a good series on Netflix called Dirty Money, and there's one episode on gold. And I think I've known this for some time, but that episode also crystallized it deeper. It's like, you can't buy gold, like any new gold, and feel good about it. It's all coming, at this point, it's all coming from these illegal, extractive places where indigenous territories are being destroyed, rivers are being poisoned by the mercury. And it's so corrupt because, of course, even the miners, are often poor, struggling people, and they're not making even any money, and they're also poisoning themselves doing this work. But then it gets very quickly sold on and into these big companies in the United States. So, I mean, just on a consumer level, I think there's enough gold in our world that we can reuse and reclaim. And you don't have to not wear gold, but you can wear maybe antique gold or just gold that's already. I just think this is a big consumer decision. And then with oil and coal, we need to. It's like there's already a lot of talk about oil having peaked and it being already completely collapsed. So this is the time, if more than ever, to bring in the renewable energies and the technologies that have actually been, with us for a long time, but have not been funded, have not been supported. And now we need more than ever to consider localized energy sources and how we can, and I just, on my personal level, I want to, I mean, it's nice, on a personal level, I want to have solar panels on my house and then, also be independent off the grid. I mean, Costa Rica is said to be completely renewable green energy because it's all hydro power. So that's one thing, at least it's not coal and oil, but then we also need to look at the effect of dams and hydro and how damaging that's been on ecosystems and on people who live in those areas. So yeah, it's not, it's not necessarily simple, but we should be
but if
bringing
we don't
attention.
have leaders that are promoting that currently, do you think that's gonna happen? Because it's like right now, while we are quarantined and we have this whole like fear campaign, you have Saudi Arabia, Russia, United States, Mexico even trying to figure out the best deal to get the oil prices running and everything. So that's concerning because none of the conversation right now, I mean, maybe it can change with next week, the Earth Day, but it hasn't happened yet. There's not a conversation on, hey, this economic model, based on extractive industries and non-renewable sources is not sustainable on the long run. And most of these politicians are also being financed, their electoral campaigns are being financed by these huge companies, and I'm getting chills talking about this, but by these huge companies that are not gonna allow, they're gonna change suddenly, we're gonna be the Green New Deal or the Paris Accord, let's do it tomorrow. It's no, like, they're not gonna allow it. And they have the money and they have the power and they have the infrastructure, and also they have what is needed now, which is, if you break it down, those industries, a lot of people will run out of jobs, which is one of the reasons why Donald Trump got elected, because he was promising to revamp the coal industry and the steel industry in the middle of the United States. So my question is this: I mean, yes, we can advocate for renewable energy and we can talk about this, but what about our leaders? If our leaders are not on the same page, I mean, what can we do at the local level if at this higher levels there's still not an awareness or a consciousness, or if there is being tied or being how is it, kidnapped by these other power dynamics?
Well, I mean, first of all, just acknowledging that we have a complete failure of leadership across, really, like, I don't think these predominantly men in these positions are in any way like really powerful. Coming back to the beginning of the conversation, like truly, and this fear and this, you just see the fragility right now. It's very thinly veiled. It's becoming more and more clear that they have no idea what they're doing, and they're just clinging to ideas and concepts and whatever they can do. I do think we need to fully remember as people, as population, that they are working for us in democracies. This is the whole fundamental understanding. But the dialogue has changed to the idea that these people are in power and they're our leaders, and they're working for us, and we need to express and communicate what we care about. And I read a really good report that shared all the workers, all the employees, all the engineers who've been part of these extractive industries such as oil and coal. Like, they would be the best minds to transition over to renewable energy, and to an effective leadership and government would be thinking of this bigger plan and not destroying all these people's jobs. There would be a transition plan, and these people would be slowly brought over to renewable technologies. And really, these people are already highly skilled and should be employed in this way. So there's definitely people who are thinking about this, and I think there are ways this could be done. It just begs us to ask, like, are our leaders willing to ever do that? And I think they have to answer to us, and we have to remember that, because it's been eroded over time, I think, the sense of people. And I think the one benefit of say like Trump coming into power was that it created outrage, and it created a lot of since he came into power, a lot of movements have really built up energy and steam. And I just think we've changed the narrative so big from people, from the ground. It's like, I've learned things I had no clue about, coming from my small Welsh town, and the education I got. I didn't know what it was like to be a Black person in America, and what it was really fundamentally like what is still, what has not changed, and what is still in place today. And these conversations have had so much more. I don't think we can forget the power of people and our influence, and how we just keep going. What was, I guess, scary for me was just like how willing we are to kind of to act like everything is good when we have leaders that make us feel better. So Obama is a great example, and I think he's like, seems like a really great guy. But in terms of foreign policy and things that were taking place, like drone warfare that just killed villages of people, including civilians and young children and people, and this doesn't even get talked about or reported on, but it's a fact. And I could not, as a woman, it was seen as this huge progression to vote for Hillary Clinton. But of course, I think she was potentially the better person than Trump on the surface. But I think the reason why people didn't vote for her, in America, is because they were so sick of the status quo and how it wasn't really serving them. And Hillary Clinton, coming back to Kissinger, calls Kissinger one of her good friends and mentors. And her foreign policy work was very much along the same lines of domination, of colonialism. So maybe she was thinking of women's rights and women and many good things within America, but also abroad, her mindset was still this domination and control. Anyway, all of that is to say, we need to look. I never stop questioning everything that's going on and looking at our leaders, and I think hopefully not stopping these groundswell movements that have picked up a lot of momentum, and where you can't ignore it anymore. You can't ignore the conversations around transgender people, and even gender, and what does it even mean, gender, and like women's rights, and like this conversation that have like the Me Too movement that it's just brought up so much more. But we need to not stop. Like right now, I was shocked to find that it's pretty much impossible to have an abortion across the United States because it's seen as a non-essential medical thing. And this conversation of what is non-essential and essential, who gets to decide? Many people have found incredible benefits from holistic healing practices, which you could say is you could say is placebo effect or just wishful thinking. But if it works, it works. And I think we need a different conversation about what is essential. Yeah, in, in
I
our
have,
services.
I have these two final questions. One of them is very loaded. With the upcoming Earth Day, there's a lot of conversation on how, you were talking about male leadership and how there's this failure and failings worldwide. But also there's a recent talk on how female leaders are handling the pandemic better. And in terms of containing it, in terms of, being more aware of people and, nurturing whatever that stereotype is. But you have like the cases of New Zealand, the cases of Singapore, the cases of Taiwan, Germany, Sweden. And there's this whole conversation of female leadership being more in tune with a soft issue as it could be seen health is. But there's also this conversation on Earth Day and how these exploitative measures and the way that capitalism works and how politics is very toxic masculinity driven. They're exploiting Mother Earth, like as the Earth being a woman, and exercising violence against the planet, against a female version of mother. And there are two lines of thought. And I want to know if you think that there's any connection with the way that female leaders are, working these crises, and if it's connected to, Mother Earth, and if we should see Earth as a mother. What are your views?
I think study after study has shown that women are effective leaders, and that they are, even in terms of on the smaller scale, when you bring aid, mothers or women are more likely to look after the entire community, because they consider the children, and it's just part of, I guess our nature. And I do believe fundamentally understanding ourselves as children of the earth is fundamental to us surviving here. And we're at a point of, are we going to survive or not, as a human race? And to any, when we understand how powerful she is, and I think really unconsciously we have for a long time, and civilization has been scared of it, so it's been trying to control and contain. You see, it doesn't work because these fires and hurricanes, all these things that happen because we're not in right balance. And this is the wisdom of indigenous people who humble themselves to being children of the earth and listening and paying attention. Always this consideration of balance and giving and receiving and being within yourself and then as a community in right balance. And I think I applaud women who've worked their way up through this patriarchal structures within politics and industry, because I could not do that. My soul felt like I couldn't do it when I had that choice. When I came out of university, I had to find my own path. But those women, even if they've had to play the masculine game, I think there is going to be inherently within them, unconsciously, subconsciously, or very consciously, the more typical nurturing values, or the more understanding of people. And it might just be the fact that we bleed every month, and that we have this experience of, it's nearly like humbled, and you're humbled, and if you choose to become a mother, you experience that incredible rite of passage, and you're like, wow, this is so powerful. And you just have this deep appreciation, I think, for life and for that experience. And this is what also indigenous cultures in general understand, and that's why they have very deeply held rites of passages and initiations for men, for women also, but women have these natural rites of passages kind of within our physiology, and men need it to become men. so that you are in deep respect and are humbled to the earth. It's not until you do a vision quest and you're 5 days in the wild by yourself that you fully understand you are so small within this great web of life. And you're also vast and powerful and magical and strong, because you're part of this earth. It's both. And we when we talk about patriarchy and masculinity, we're talking about the toxic sides, because I do believe we fundamentally need these deeply, masculine figures. We need people to step into both the feminine and the masculine. And I think we should not be afraid. One of the most damaging narratives we've been given as women is that being nurturing, being caring, being all of this is seen as soft. Whereas I think it's also a deep power. And the way we even look about, and I think for me, if I could fantasize, we would place mothers back at the center of society as, the life givers. And this is really, my research has been looking into the context of our major religions and the way they were formed. And so you came from these more earth-based tribal communities that always had the mother at the center. And very quickly, religion became politicized, and to fit the political agenda at the time, which was to create war, which was to create centralized hierarchical power. I believe personally that Judaism and Christianity and all these major religions were also fitted within this context. So we know, for example, in Christianity, that there were whole gospels destroyed and missing. So we're also missing the whole story. And I believe the roots and the beauty and the truth of it is true. I think it's there's a spiritual depth to it that is beautiful. But when we understand actually how these things were created, and how immediately within those stories, like Adam and Eve, women were given the role. First of all, creation was taken from the woman. Women are immediately suppressed to the least important within the society, because previously they were upheld as the most important, as the life givers, as the survival of a tribe, of a community, and suddenly, brought down. And the whole philosophy of ascending and reaching higher to God, to sky, and the fact that we are here only to get to the afterlife has meant that we are actually being completely okay. And not everyone is connected so much to religion anymore, but it still influenced the way our whole society was built and the foundations it still runs upon, which is this mindset that we can extract and we can take and we can dump and we can do all these things because we're getting to heaven and the afterlife, and not realizing we are actually in the Garden of Eden right now, and we're not appreciating it. So I once we recenter the mother in terms of Mother Earth, and we also value Father Sky, and we value that, but they are equal and they are one and the same. And in a lot of the older indigenous and ancestral stories, you can see that the underworld is just as important as the upper world. And that, again, I believe if we can start understanding the narratives differently, we can start rewriting our story. And it's huge, because we don't realize how these narratives have been running our entire life. And I think for me, just having studied economics and understanding the globalized systems of trade and so on, was really valuable for me to realize it's just a narrative, and it's something that can be rewritten. And to acknowledge that patriarchy has just been an experiment, and it's actually been a tiny experiment within the greater human history. When we're talking about ourselves as indigenous, ourselves as tribal people, as native people, that makes up about 95% at least of our human experience here on Earth. And so it makes actually this patriarchal experiment very small in the grand scheme of things. But the way we've been taught and told is that it's the way things have always been. Men have always been dominant. This has always been the way. And really a lot of evidence contradicts that. So I think reclaiming that and being able to really be bold enough to reimagine our systems, and to each of us as people to take that time and take that initiative, because we are more powerful than we realize. We can all step out of these dominating narratives by just choosing to do so. It can happen automatically. We need to pay attention to who we are influenced by, who is speaking to us, what we are hearing, what narratives are on repeat. Like, again, just as an example, in terms of Black people, specifically in America, I realized I was totally conditioned by every film and TV I'd ever watched that showed them as criminals, or as and also just even in Africa, you see like all the time starving children, and your only image of Africa is that it's starving. In fact, it's so rich and intelligent and beautiful, and there's also like so many cultures and communities and things that we could learn from and understand. And again, these narratives, we need to shift and change and demand them to be changed, I think, as people, and continue to have these kind of conversations.
I love it.
Yeah.
I love it. I want to continue on. Maybe we can do like a second part of this interview, because I want to continue talking to you. But before we go, I want to ask you, some of our viewers will be extremely interested in knowing more about your work, and how can they support Soul Seed Gathering? What are the links? What are the information? And how can they reach you?
I think the most exciting thing to be part of right now is the Soul Seed House. So it's our membership space. It's our place where we're just beginning to put all of our research, all of our work, where we're having these conversations. So it's not just research that remains dead and flat on the page. It's something that we can really start to shift the narratives and start. And I even though it can sometimes be heavy to go through some of the things that have taken place, it's necessary work, and it's also very freeing. And I can just speak personally, it's changed my life in the most beautiful ways. Like the gifts that have come from it, too much to even talk about. So it's a really exciting place to be. If it's out of your price range, if it's not accessible, then we have a Patreon, and it's just launched, and you could maybe be the first supporter. You can support for as little as $1 a month, but really any amount that you can give, and we will send you insights from the house every month, and you can still be part of this journey. And it really does help, I think, while we're looking, for grants and for investors and patrons and so on. Like, I think we're still an earth-based, sort of from the ground organization. And so the movement of people joining it, like, this is the time. I feel like I had to take a lot of time to get right by it within myself, and to make sure I knew what I was doing. And it's still a forever learning project, but this is the time that I'm really excited to invite everyone into it. So I would love to see you there, and that's really the main place.
Thank you so much, Hannah, for your time. I'm so excited. I invite everybody to check soulseedgathering.com. Get into the house, learn about the latest developments, news, and research that Hannah and her team have been doing. Amazing chapters on Guatemala, Colombia, Brazil, and also other indigenous communities around the world. I invite you to check their accounts, and looking forward to our next episode. We will continue conversations on these amazing times. Thank you so much, Hannah, for your time.
Thank you so much, Natalia.